And now what we have is the panel discussion on the age and rage of climate fiction, right? And when we say this, the interesting thing is that it is a conversation, it is a genre that has been really picking up, especially worldwide. So there is genuinely a rage about climate fiction. Um, and what makes this panel interesting today is that rarely will you come across, a combination where you'll see climate fiction being discussed from perspectives of very from writers are writing on different subjects in a sense, and yet about climate fiction. So for instance, we have a children's author, so she'll be able to bring out the nuance of, writing climate fiction for children. We have, Chen, who writes sci-fi, but, his work blurs into climate fiction. Mr. Atulya comes at the intersection of business and climate fiction. And obviously, Rajat, he's a climate advocate. He's, I would say his work is deeply involved in climate fiction, and not just writing, but even outside of writing. So this is, so I'm real, like, this is going to, again, I think, be a conversation where all of them will end up, also wanting to continue that conversation later. And yeah, so in fact, before I go further, what I also want to say is, tell you a little about Rajat, who's going to lead this conversation. So he is a bilingual writer. He writes in Bengali and English. He's a columnist, editor, and co-editor of speculative and solar punk stories. And he's the author of several books, including The Butterfly Effect, and that is his book on climate fiction. It was listed by Book Riot among the 50 must-read eco-disasters in fiction, and also 10 works of environmental literature from around the world. He's lectured on climate and literature in the University of Oxford and also other venues. He's advocated climate issues at the UN, New York, and has been awarded several fellowships. Rajat, can you turn your video on? I'm sure everyone wants to see you while I'm introducing you. Yes. Hi. Hi to all of you. And hi, Rajat. So, well, as a starting point, Rajat, what I was thinking is, because we can actually take from the previous session too. Hari brought this up, and before, long before this discussion, even Amitav Ghosh brought this up, about this question about why has this genre been a little slow to catch in India? And I know you have answers to that. So I'd like you to touch upon that a bit, as you touch upon climate fiction, and also tell us a little bit about your book, because everyone has heard of The Butterfly Effect, but obviously your book takes it in a very different context, through fiction. So all of that, and obviously, you'll do the honors of introducing a wonderful panel. So yes, over to you, Rajat.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja. Thank you for inviting me to speak here. We have an excellent lineup, as I see: Vijal Bachcharajani, Chen Qiufan, and Atulya Mishra. I will briefly introduce the topic of cli-fi and also touch upon the question that you have asked, what kind of cli-fi is being written in post-colonial nations, India and others. So, but let us go back to, a very old story, the story of the Arabian Nights, the story of the hunchback in Arabian Nights. If some of us can remember it, there was this hunchback who went to the home of the tailors, a tailor couple, and he choked there and died. And the tailor couple took the body and put him in the Jewish doctor's doorstep. And the Jewish doctor, when he was coming out, he tripped and fell, and he thought that he has killed the hunchback. And so he takes that body and puts it down a chimney where a chef finds it, and the chef thinks that he has killed the hunchback. And this goes on for a while. And so this kind of storytelling, where slightly abnormal, slightly low probability events followed one another, where there was this concatenation of low probability events, was very common in old times. It's not only in Arabian Nights, there is Decameron in some of these Indian story cycles, like Panchatantra, which is more about animals. But that kind of storytelling was very popular. People used to listen to it sitting around a fire and things like that. But with the advent of modernism in literature, a new kind of story began to be told, where these improbabilities were joined up by what is called fillers, a slow, easygoing life. And why this happened? Some researchers say this happened because modern fiction was kind of emulating or paralleling the easygoing life of the bourgeois. So now what happens? Climate change. Climate change in itself is a concatenation or a procession of unlikely low probability events. A lot of strangeness is there. And so this new kind of writing that modernism has brought in, where the improbabilities are covered with fillers, this new kind of writing is not very prepared to engage with climate fiction, with climate change. So we need to go back to that old kind of storytelling. That's one way, that's one entry point into climate fiction. But there are several other ways of approaching it. We can first ask the question why this fiction writing is important, of course, to understand climate change, to understand how it will be to live in a climate changed world. That is one of the main functions of any kind of fiction. When the nuclear there was serious trouble between the US and the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that. There was a lot of nuclear fiction being written of the nuclear holocaust and things like that. So similarly, we need to understand the future of climate change. Even climate fiction that is used in video games can be used for anticipatory governance exercises and things like that. So that way, we answer the why question, why these stories are important. But what kind of stories are we talking about? So there have been various people discussing this, various researchers and writers and other people. So one of them, important one, is Nick Adamson, who has talked about the six proposals for the reform of literature in the age of climate change, where he talks about doing away with the lone hero, writing about systems and not only objects, and also authors giving up their ambition only and thinking about the nature and the world and several other things. So that's one way this kind of fiction is being defined, or an agenda or a template is being created for this kind of writing. There are several others. Gregers Anderson has talked about imaginaries. He has divided maybe 100, 150 books and films on climate change into 5 or 6 imaginaries. But the imaginaries are like, social breakdown, loss of wilderness, the sphere imaginary, and so on. And each presents a different kind of world which has been changed by climate change. So that's one way of approaching this kind of writing. Another very important characteristic of climate fiction is the uncanny, which has been developed by people like Gregers Anderson, but it comes from, the theories of Freud and Heidegger and other people. Basically, it is talking about, uncanny is, if you think about that movie, Into the Storm, where there's a scene, even if you haven't seen it, there's a scene where there is this funnel of a tornado picking up this storm chaser. His name is, I think, Pete. And the tornado funnel is slowly turning him around high up in the sky. And you feel almost like that funnel is watching this person, this human being, before throwing him down to his death. This kind of, this kind of uncanny that you feel when nature behaves like an animated, nature becomes animated, is a kind of uncanny that you find in many novels. And this idea comes from Freud, where he talked about past repressions animating objects. But in the case of climate fiction or climate change, this is not past repression. This is what we have done to nature, the way we have exploited it, coming back to us through all of these things, all of these phenomena, tornadoes and droughts and several other things. So that's a kind of uncanny which we find in climate fiction. The other kind is, of course, the Heideggerian uncanny, where the world outside has changed so much that you get an eerie feeling inside you, and which is present in many climate stories. One of the good examples, of course, is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. How it's a post-apocalyptic US where a father and son are traveling in search of water and other good people. So uncanny is a very important characteristic of climate writing. Then how are these stories working? Are these stories helping us to understand climate change better? So yeah, there are several studies being done on this. A very important researcher is Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, who has found that these stories are having emotional impact, but mostly on liberals. much less on conservative. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Also, repetitive storytelling has been found to be very effective in changing mindsets, views, ideas about climate change, and several other things. Personal stories of climate change or effects of climate change have been found to be very powerful. And so these kinds of empirical, eco-critical research where people have been asked to read books and give feedback are being done to understand climate fiction, to understand the efficacy of climate fiction. Similarly, activists are using other
Rajat,
tools.
I'm sorry to interrupt you actually, but I was just hoping that, you would also now also bring in the authors because they've,
Yeah.
and as you kind of weave this in, because I'm sure all of this has linkages to, some of their books and what, they
I was just about to do that. Yeah. So there's this other kind of, way that we can examine climate fiction using, sustainable development goals of the United Nations, production and consumption flows. And in fact, in some of the books written by the authors that are present here, in like Atulya Mishra's book or even Bijal's book, we can use some of these tools, like whether this book or the characters or the plot is aware of SDGs, is aware of the production and consumption flows, which leads to emissions and climate change, global warming and climate change, and all those other things. So all kinds of climate writing can be examined using these tools. So that's basically that's a very basic introduction to climate fiction. And of course, in post-colonial nations, we find a dearth of climate change fiction. One of the reasons could be, post-colonial writers look very closely at power, and always they do not make the connections with emissions, exploitation. They are very focused on justice and power, but it is also changing. We already have two writers here. We have Amitav Ghosh's work and several others. So it is changing, and I believe there will be more and more climate writing coming up. And very briefly about my novel, it's called The Butterfly Effect. It is about a genetically modified experiment gone wrong in the backdrop of climate change, and it happens in various places of the world, but it begins and ends in a dystopic India focused around Calcutta in a near future, where there has been a war and climate has totally changed. There are droughts and several other things, acid rain and things like that, which I think again connects with Chen's book very much, because Chen's book is talking about waste, how waste is exported to developing countries. It's mainly he's talking about electronic waste and how people who sort this electronic waste get affected by it and how they turn around and try to do something about it. So that's a very brief introduction to CLIFI. And let me now introduce our authors present here. We have a very brilliant lineup. Chen Qiufan, as you already know, is an award-winning Chinese speculative fiction author, translator, creative producer, and curator. He is the honorary president of the Chinese Science Fiction Writers Association, and he has a seat on the X Prize Foundation Science Fiction Advisory Council. His most recent works include Waste Tide, dubbed an eco-techno thriller with heart, soul, and brain, and AI 2041. Interestingly, I would like to ask Chen later about AI 2041, because I was listening to an interview of his, and I think part of this is based in India and in Western India or somewhere like that. So we will try to discuss that. Bijal, as you all know, is a very popular children's author, and she has written other books also on the environment. She is a book editor at Pratham Books. Her book, A Cloud Called Bhura, won the Author Children's Book Award. And she has also recently published another CLIFI called Savi and the Memory Keeper. She has a master's in environment security and peace from the University for Peace, and she's a certified climate warrior. Atulya Mishra is a senior IAS officer, additional chief secretary of the government of Tamil Nadu, and author of two CLIFI novels, Oxygen Manifesto and Vultures of Paradise. He has done a PhD on carbon footprints, and he has worked in Pollution Control Board at a senior level, and also Department of Industries, Environment and Forests in the government of Tamil Nadu. So this is a kind of very brief introduction. And can we just move on to the discussion? I would like to ask questions to Chen first to begin with, if that is okay. Hi, Chen.
Sure.
I'm really, I was really enjoying reading your waste tide. And, it took me back to some of the activist work I've done with, lead acid battery recycling and things like that, all the waste that comes from lead acid batteries and fly ash also. But my question to you is about science fiction and climate fiction. Do you consider waste tide, whether is it cli-fi or is it sci-fi or is it something in between? And why so?
Right. Thanks for having me to Greenlit Fest. It's a great opportunity to have this kind of conversation with you. So back in the day, I wrote Waste Tide. It was actually 10 years ago. So back then, we have not a clue what cli-fi is, not even like people in China talking about climate change and environmental issues such as today. So I think I don't have that kind of mindset like writing a book into cli-fi or any kind of like specific genre, but I think it's based on the real situation happened around my hometown. So it's actually just like using science fiction as the framework that could like fit in different cultural background, like people around the world might feel resonate with the issue itself, because we all know it's a global issue. It's not only in China, but also in India, Southeast Asia, Africa. And of course, as you mentioned, it's a post-colonial issue as well, because all this kind of invisible electronic waste was shipped from the developed country like UK and US, such like super rich countries. So because of the principle of not in my backyard, they decided to ship all this kind of trash in a pretty much illegal way or sneaky way to other developing countries such as China. So they transfer all this kind of damages to the environment and the people to, I think, in the more invisible way to colonial the economically and culturally and environmentally, for sure. So I think after writing the book, I start to realize there's huge landscape behind the scene. So even like before that, I start to look into the industry and got a chance to visit more people, scholars, researchers in the field. Then reviews to me is more serious than I used to think. So I think right now it becomes something more mainstream, like people start to talking about it. Even in China, we have our own waste problems as well. So I think now it's become something quite relevant to the climate change and environmental issue in a broader sense. So I'm pretty happy I did it. And I think I'll continue to explore the theme in the future works, because right now I'm working on the sequels of the Waste Tide. So I'm pretty much looking to the South India, like Sri Lanka, etc. So I really would love to learn more what's happening there.
Thank you. Can I move on to Atulya Mishra ji? I read the Oxygen Manifesto and I really liked it. It took me back to, Ernest Callenbach's writing, Ecotopia and that kind of work, very activist, where grassroots movements have been placed at the center. And your character Chandra Bose is very interesting. It reminded me of Subhash Chandra Bose also, by the way. But the question that I wanted to ask you, because there's an IPS officer there, how much of it is autobiographical? And yeah, let me begin with this question, and then I have other questions for you.
It's very difficult to say that it is autobiographical, because although there are some glimpses of memories and also characterization of few people whom I have interacted, with whom I have worked very closely. Actually, what happened was that I studied in Delhi University at a time when environmental activism had just started. And many of the social scientists had started considering environmental issues as one of the core issues where the social paradoxes lie. So there were movements like Kalpavriksha in Delhi, where students were exposed for walks around the river projects. For example, I went for the Narmada walk all the way up to Amarkantak. We were exposed to like Dunu Roy, who used to be a champion of rights for cyclists in those days. Then we were exposed to Vanvasi Ashram. And then, of course, everybody had to take a career. So I opted and I attempted for the civil services, and I became an officer. And being an IS officer was not actually detrimental to what I was trying to do as a person who was concerned about the environment, because I got exposure for doing the things in the parameters of law, and also how the political executive thinks about environmental issues, how we can cajole them into bringing an environment on focus. And then I worked in the Pollution Control Board. I worked as Forest Secretary, and I also was Secretary Industries, which used to normally have problems with environmentalists. I worked in a port as a chairman of a port, where again we were often on the other side of the fence, where the environmentalists used to find to be detrimental to the coastal system, to the mangroves. So we had, that time the concept of sustainable development was also coming in, and I got a chance to study in for sustainable development, both in India as well as abroad. Then I thought that a very fenced life. At least let me come out in writing where I can be what I really wish to be. So there were officers who had influenced me, and there were activists and even politicians who had influenced me. And, I was fascinated by Subhash Chandra Bose. Almost everybody who lived in our times was fascinated by Subhash Chandra Bose and the mysteries around him. So actually the first book, which I call Oxygen Manifesto, I had started it by calling it In Search of Bose. And that's why the character also is Ravi Chandran Bose, which is a very, very common in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu, we have very interesting names. We have Indira Gandhi, we have Jawaharlal Nehru, we have Subhash Chandra Bose, we have Ramanand. We have all kind of names which, when they don't differentiate between the name and a surname. So often the entire name is taken. So we have a large number of Subhash Chandra Bose and even Bose in Tamil Nadu. So something came from there, and then I built a story. I read that India is a very, very different kind of a society. We consider India to be, most of the India to be either Tamil or Kannada or Bengali but there had been islands of different cultures which are present all over. For example, in Moreh district of Manipur, there is an island of Tamilians. And that fascinated me, and that's why I created this character of Tata in Manipur. And these microcultures also have great affinity to the place from where they have come from. So they have not severed their linkage. For example, a particular Ur festival in Tamil Nadu, we see suddenly people coming from Malaysia, people coming from Indonesia, and people coming from the Western world, just for a few days to, again set their umbilical cord with the place where they originated from. And then I thought I will, the Green Movement had started in Germany, and I thought, why not try to create a person who by education and by training is a bureaucrat. And then he starts the first Green Party of India. And what will be the challenges which he will face? What will be the issues which he may have to address? That was the basic idea. And that's how the book evolved.
Thank you. Fascinating. Let me move on to Bijal. A Cloud Called Bhura. It's one of the very popular children's novels that have come out around climate fiction, climate change in recent times. And I really liked some of this, the dark humor and sarcasm that you have used in Khabar Bhayankar and things like that. Would you preface, I will ask you a question, but would you preface your answer with a very small a synopsis of the book so that our audience gets to know what it is about the brown cloud that hovers over Mumbai? And my question to you would be, after you preface your answer with the synopsis, it is a kind of, a slightly activist, slightly awareness-oriented novel, A Cloud Called Bhura. And it is not easy to write that kind of a text, which can also entertain the reader. Activist-oriented or awareness-oriented texts used to generally get boring after a point, but you have managed it beautifully. It's much easier to write, dystopia, spectacular dystopia sometimes. So how do you do that? How did you make this? How do you craft this novel in a way that it entertains and also passes on the message of climate change? But please begin your answer by telling us a bit about the story.
Sure. Thanks, Rajat. So I was studying climate change in around 2012 in Costa Rica, and I came across this Asian brown cloud phenomena, and satellite pictures had captured it over many parts of the global south of the world. And what fascinated me as I read it was just how people were reacting to it in the news and all of that. So I started wondering that, this is a cloud you can't see, but you can kind of feel. But what if this cloud was actually real and it hovered on top of the city I come from, that's Mumbai? How would people react? So the whole premise started with that. And then suddenly all the characters who come into play when it comes to climate change, who kind of define what climate change is to people. So there were the politicians, there was the media, there were the bureaucrats, there were the adults, the parents, the scientists, who all had their own point of view. And then there were these 4 children who are called Amni, Mithil, Tammy, and Andrew, who are just like, no, we need, all of this is not making any sense. And you're just forgetting there's this brown cloud still on top of us. We want to know what's happening. We need answers now. And so they get on to a quest, which is kind of like a quest of scientific discovery, which takes them across the city. It makes them meet different people, different children. And it basically stemmed a lot from my work with children around environment and my strong belief, having seen them, that children care. And going to your question, Rajat, one of the things is that a friend of mine read the book and he said, listen, you've got to call it an adventure because that's what it is. There is a lot of information, and I have been an activist in many ways in my life. And so, which is why Amni is perhaps an activist in the book. But I think I've always come across children who care so much that they take those first steps. You walk into a school, I used to walk into a school and they would actually check, ask you, do you have plastic in your bag? Because then you'll be fined because our school is a no plastic zone. I've had children who've come together in Sanctuary Asia to make a junior tiger task force report when the tiger numbers were dwindling. They would reach out to me with emails saying, this is happening, what can we do? So I kind of feel like I wanted it to be a response to their questions as well. And if you see the children who are not activists very clearly in the book, who are just like, I have homework to do, I am not doing all of this. So, which is why I put all of these kids together, like how you would find in a classroom at any point of time. And I mean, so far, all the children who read it have always come back saying, what can we do? Unlike most of the adults in the room who are just like, there's not much we can do.
Thank you. We are already getting questions. If any of the audience has questions, please type it out in the chat box. But let me return to Stanley. One of the images in your novel, West Tide is of this, this detached biotronic, I think you call it biotronic, hand, which is kind of clawing the ground and moving by itself. That is a very powerful image that has remained with me for like 2 days since I read your book. And have you had a training in science, or have you worked in a lab or something like that? Where did this idea come from? And to add to that, I wanted to ask you also about AI, because I have seen your interviews and you have been talking about artificial intelligence and a lot. And do you think climate change can be countered using AI in some ways, like new batteries or things like that, or some other technology? Can AI be useful in dealing with climate change to an extent?
Right. So I used to work for Google and Baidu, so the counterpart of Google in China. So for like almost a decade. And also I used to work for a tech startup doing virtual reality and motion capture. So I couldn't say I'm an expert, but I'm always a fan for science fiction and technology since kid. So I did a lot of research across different fields. So yes. And for your second question, I think definitely. So right now there are some startup companies actually using AI as a technology to fight against the climate change. For example, using the satellite image, like computer vision, we can detect the hotspots, like the mountainous area. So you can predict where might be a mountainous fire. So you can put it off like previously not to causing a huge damage. And also, for example, like if we want to massively apply the clean energy, we need this kind of like a breakthrough on battery material. So I think that totally needs something like AI, just similar to AlphaFold. Like you can predict the protein structure folding, but in the future you may get a chance to use AI to create a lot of different material structure, which might help us to build up the new battery to storage all this kind of clean energy, and also like smartly distributed the electricity across the country. So that also need a lot of like computation power. But meanwhile, AI itself, like because it requires so a huge amount of computation power, it always create a lot of like carbon emission for now. So I think the ultimate solution is like energy revolution. So that's something I think AI should help a lot in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, one related problem that comes to my mind is, even if you're talking about solar or wind, that requires a lot of land. And if we really have to supply power to the whole world using these renewables, there is not, we don't have so much land in the world because people are living on it, or there is agriculture or things like that. That is a problem which I think AI wouldn't be able to tackle. AI can be useful in storage batteries or things like that. So that is something that comes to my mind. But we have a question for you, Chen. Mike, okay. This person is asking, I read the blurb of your book and will get it soon. As waste is a huge problem where I live. But my question is about speculative fiction. What do you think is the role of speculative stories of a climate-ravaged future in a world where climate disasters are becoming a reality for many?
Right, I think right now, like sci-fi is kind of realism literature, exactly, as we might put it. So as Bijal just mentioned, we have to make each one feel related to. It's not just showing you the data or this kind of like infogram and like reports from the government or the dry facts, but we need to make everyone feel if something could happen upon on each individual and or even our offsprings. So that's something might totally change our life in the future. So I think storytelling absolutely will be the most powerful tool for people to resonate create this kind of consensus on climate change, because without this kind of consensus, we couldn't take action accordingly, like in a collaborative way. So I think that's totally the bottleneck here. Like there's so many different parties around the world, so many different cultures and countries. Each one have their own takes from the issue and have their own interests. But if we couldn't work together, there's no way to solve this problem as a human civilization as a whole. So that's my point.
Yeah, and storytelling does have a very important role there. We all believe that. I think Kim Stanley Robinson says that the present is a science fiction novel that we're all writing together, or something to that effect. Let me move on to, okay, so there's a question for Vijal, I think. Okay, this says, I'm reading a cloud called Bhura and will be asking students to read it too. It is great that you're writing Cli-Fi for children because they have the biggest stake in the future. As educators, we would like to know if there are efforts to include these stories in syllabi, and if you have any ideas how we can incorporate it into our teaching too.
Firstly, thank you, Sudeshna, for reading the book. And I think, honestly, teachers, according to me, are perhaps one of the most important people, because you're the ones who shape our future generation, shape our readers. So thank you for all that you do. My book, So You Want to Know About the Environment, which is nonfiction, is part of syllabus in many schools because it comes with little primers on different parts of nature and environment, and has activities that children can do. Bhura has also been part of a lot of reading lists that schools do. And I do a lot of fun exercises in schools. We have this little activity where children write, reimagine their city with a climate crisis. But before that, we also look at the way the city is in this present form using their senses and how much they need to treasure it. So you can, there's also lots of actions at the back of the book when you get to it, where the children take action, and you could literally replicate some of those checklists into your classroom. And if you do, please let me know. Good luck.
Thank you, Bijal. There is another question for Mr. Modi. Okay, I will come to that question, but I have a question for Atulya. With your vast experience in the service and working for governments, what do you think will happen? Like, will suddenly one day all these governments will sit down and decide that, no, we have to get to net zero very quickly, time is running out, and industry will also fall in line? Or will the pressure finally come from the street and there will be a very disruptive change, as happens in your book, actually? All these circles, they come together and there is a new government formed suddenly. Like common people, they come together in circles. You call those circles, like 3 or 4 people coming together and changing the country. Will it happen like that? Will the ultimate disruptive power or force come from the streets? Or do you think suddenly there will be a change in mind of our rulers or the business or other stakeholders?
I would suggest that we learn from history. When there was a major crisis for and ozone holes being created, the world had actually come together and resolved it. It was very difficult in those days to say that we will not go for refrigerations, we will not go for aerosol. But still the world came together, and to a great extent, the ozone repaired today. The same thing also happened during nuclear disarmament. We reached a pinnacle where we had capacity to destroy the earth many, many times. And today, I think the major dialogue on the world scenario is not about armament. We are moving towards nuclear disarmament, and that has become a thing of a past. The nuclear race and the race for more nuclear weapons have become a thing of past. The same goes for global warming. I think the world is now realizing that we can't live with temperature rising. And the worst affected is not only the island nations, but also all urban areas, because they have become the sink for huge rain. Where the rain is needed, we are not getting rain there. The village and the countryside and the place where we are growing, we are having agriculture, we are finding limited rain. And all the clouds are now bursting over our head in the cities. So the realization is coming. And I think the world will, come together. There had been recently a summit, and there also net zero concept was promoted. Of course, there are a lot of issues regarding who will take the responsibility of the past, whether the countries who are now trying to develop, they have, some leeway in this kind of a scenario. But I think that also is coming to some kind of a solution. So I don't think the world will see a civil war and people fighting on the street just because real concerns about environment are not being addressed. But there is another issue, with COVID-19, we found a lot of people having psychological issues which were, which really bursted out. I have a feeling there are issues of people feeling claustrophobic in cities. They can't move on the street. The children don't play in the playgrounds. There's not much of outdoor activity. There are times when you can't breathe in properly in many cities. Many of us are now thriving on bottled water. These are issues on which there will be resistance. Time will certainly come when people will be asking for their right to walk, for their right to cycle, for their right to have some green space, and to have proper drainage, proper drinking water. Because these problems are more difficult to solve. For example, we do a lot of work on building overbridges and metros, but the last mile connectivity is just not available. So I have a feeling, I go with a mixed feeling that in certain issues where big industries, big organizations are concerned, probably a kind of a scenario where the Fourth World War will be fought with stones and all, that will not come. Whereas there will be hassles on the ground level because the poor person is getting very claustrophobic in the cities.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. You mentioned ozone depletion and the Montreal Protocol and all that. I have been slightly involved with that work too. What I feel is, the problem of the ozone hole, ozone depletion and closing it up, that is just a minute part of our lives. But when you are talking of climate change and cutting emissions, it is a whole lifestyle that has to be changed, which is why it's much more difficult compared to what has been achieved in the Montreal Protocol and ozone depletion. And there are psychological biases of human beings. We have this bias about the present, what is already going on, we want to stick to that. We have future discounting and things like that, which is why action on climate change from the consumer side also is very difficult. And leave aside the producer side, companies also have these biases similar to individual biases. So yeah, and there's a small supplementary question to you, Tulya. Someone is asking, did you gift your books to IS friends to influence them to become more green sensitive? Yeah, so yeah, I had a similar question actually.
I certainly do give my books to my friends, and many of them have read the book. But I must say, reading in many circles is coming down. With the kind of things available on social media, audiovisuals which are much easier to grasp, reading habit as such are coming down, which is a matter of pain, because if people don't read, their attention span also comes down. And so it's a global problem. And but I do give my books to the officers, and I try to make my books very simple and very readable and very short, so that they don't get antagonized by sheer size of the books. But I am also really concerned about the drop in the reading habit, which I'm seeing all across.
Yeah, surely. Bijal, you have said somewhere that inequality is our biggest divider. I think in an interview connected to a cloud called Bhura, I think. And so you have said for a lot of environment issues, inequality is our biggest divider, which is very true. Even in the case of climate, the poor are affected more, and which is why climate justice is such a big issue. I wanted to ask you, did you weave this into your story? How did you do that? How did you bring in the angle of inequality and justice into Cloud called Bhura, or your next book? What is the name? Savi, the other book that is just published.
That's a great question, Rajat, because when I initially, A Cloud Called Bhura took me 6 years to write, because I didn't know how to give it a neat and tidy ending, because how do you end climate change? So, but when I first wrote it, I wrote it from the perspective of this one child. Her name is Ammi. And somewhere it just didn't sit with me as to just seeing the world from this child's view. She does stay in a gated apartment complex. She goes to a fancy school. And then while I was staring at the draft again and again, I pretty much put it aside and I rewrote the entire book from Tammy's view. Tammy is an artist. Okay, just a second. Tammy is an RT student who goes to Amni and Mithil school. She is an Ambedkarite. She's one of my favorite characters, I think, who I've ever written. And she actually is the one who becomes that voice who questions inequalities. Because as the chaos of the climate crisis is brewing, you're seeing how it doesn't impact Amni and Mithil as much as it impacts Tammy and her family. And you're witnessing it, and then she begins questioning it and pointing out that, hey, look, for you, it's all theoretical. It's happening to me. And so this is not cool. So even Savi and the Memory Keeper, which is out tomorrow, also has that. It's pretty much, I think you can't write climate stories without addressing these issues in books today or ever.
Yeah, actually, climate justice is an area which will be more and more in focus as the days go by. Developing countries, though climate change events like forest fires or droughts, they are spread all across the world. The poor are, of course, more vulnerable. So that is a big issue. There is a question for Chen. It says, there's a big movement to convert waste to wealth. It is beginning to happen in India. What's happening in China?
Right. So I think, since 2018, so Chinese government launched a policy to ban all this 24 type of foreign waste to be shipped into China, so including electronic waste. So they trying very hard to upgrade the whole the recycling industry. So I can see like there's a lot of like improvement, like using better technology, like a more scientific way efficiently to categorize the waste and recycling all this kind of material, like all this metal and rare earth, like back to reuse. I think that's the movement here as well, but I think it also requires a lot of like private sector, like doing investment in R&D, so that we can have the right technology as a toolbox to on executive level. We can make sure everything is on the right track. So I think that's what's happening as well in China.
Okay, just a supplementary question to that, Chen. Do you think we can go on like this, like with recycling, reusing, and the circular economy and all those concepts, or do we seriously need now to think about things like radical concepts like degrowth, where growth needs to be cut at a point? Otherwise, there are very big studies now which finds that the same kind of affluence, if all the population of the world needs the same kind of affluence that's there in the advanced Western nations, then we don't have resources for that.
Right.
Yeah. So can this go on, or should we be seriously now thinking about concepts like degrowth?
Right. So I think right now we're talking about like sustainable lifestyle. It's not the luxury lifestyle like what we purchase after the US back in the day, because right now, as you can see, the economic growth rate is also slowing down because of the pandemic and some other reasons as well. So from 2-digit annually, right now it's like 1-digit, maybe is like pretty much slower down. So I think people might get used to the new kind of like lifestyle, not that much materialistic, but pretty much in a more like natural and sustainable way. So I think that's how the government try to encourage people to make the change. And also for the younger generation, they right now intended to choose those brands and products using recycling materials, like the fast fashion and also the shoes, sneakers. So if it was a claim to use this kind of recycling material, it's kind of like the price might be higher, but it's create this kind of a responsibility to the society and the environment as well. So as I can see, the younger generation and kind of buy it.
Yeah, we hope so too, that the pandemic would change people in a way. But the historical evidence is just the opposite. Like pandemics have followed with rebounds in the economy, and consumption has gone up. So that possibility is always there, that it will just bounce back. And there is a question. It's not a question. I think there is something. Yeah, it's a question for Bijal. It says, a cloud called Bhura occupies a special place in that it's among the first books of climate fiction in India's children's publishing. Did you have any doubts as a writer while penning it? And has the phenomenal response to the book been a revelation? Or do you think this is children's literature whose time has come? So,
that last question, Megha, makes me want to cheer, but I think as an author, I'm always riddled with doubts. So I actually, whatever I write, I'm petrified as it goes out into the world, or even to my editor, or even to my, readers who are friends. So while writing Bhura, I actually didn't really think much. It was only once it started going to publishing houses, I realized that everyone was seeing it as, one of the first few books on climate change. They were seeing it as talking about stuff that you don't usually always see for children. So there was there were a lot of questions that came to me about it, and I was told to drop certain things, and I just didn't want to. So and then when the book came out, I still can't get over it. It's been 2 years, and the book's still constantly being talked about, being read by children. So it makes me believe that climate is very much something that children care about, and that's what has reflected this. But I do think that as far as children's publishing about climate change goes, I feel like we're still at a nascent stage in India as compared to the rest of the world, sadly.
Yeah, we are almost out of time. So I will ask a very,
just one sec,
yeah,
before you continue. So there's a very interesting person who's in our among our participants. And if you see it, I think Rajat and Chen are actually aware of him. His name is Dan Bloom. And it's interesting because he is the person who's known to have, come up with the term Cli-Fi, which is so popularly used now. So I think it's very exciting for us as a festival that he's here. I wasn't aware that he had already seen the post. So I even, hoping that he would come, I did send him an invite, but seemed like he'd already tweeted on Twitter and all of that. So just wanted to say a welcome to you, Mr. Dan Bloom. We're really happy that you're here with us.
Yeah, hi Dan. Dan is he came up with the coinage CliFi, and he has been promoting it very vigorously actually. And now, it's very easy to climate fiction is a much bigger expression. So CliFi works, and it rhymes with sci-fi also. So that is another thing. While we're running out of time, I just wanted to ask a very simple question. I believe all of you will be writing more climate fiction. So will those be dystopian stories or hopeful stories, or something in between where you show slow progress towards change for the better? Maybe let me ask Chen first. Will your next book, you're writing a sequel to Waste Tide, you told us just now. Will it be kind of dystopian, or will it be some middle of the road kind of story, or will it be totally hopeful, like solar punk or something like that?
Right, it will have solar punk for sure, and it will have metaverse, because you might imagine maybe there'll be some transferable pollution and exploitation in the virtual reality for sure, because it requires so many computation, rendering, and also all this kind of equipment. It is also like electronic devices. So it should like create all those kind of like environmental issue to elsewhere of the world. So I actually just finished another book for kids. It's on carbon neutrality. So as you might know, it's a big theme for China and also for the rest of the world, because China commit to reach the point of carbon neutrality in 2060. So I think that's how our children's generation, they might gonna experience this great match towards this mission. So I think it's totally necessary to build up this kind of mindset to help them understand why, what is carbon neutrality, and why we need it, and what's the relationship between carbon neutrality with the climate change and biodiversity, etc. And what can we do as an individual, like a citizen? What can we do in our daily life to change, make a small piece of contribution? So that's my new book coming out next year.
Congratulations. Hopeful stories are actually very important. Hopeful stories, activist stories, and stories like that. But also, for some people, grief does work. I have been thinking about this for a long time. And if you read Jem Mendel's paper on deep adaptation, there he talks about the power of grief to change people's minds. And I think about the Buddha also sometimes. He saw all those sights of a dying man, an old man, and a sick man, and then he leaves his home. And he founds a religion, a world religion, which might have saved numerous people, which popularized the concept of non-attachment and things like that. So grief and darkness does have a role in all this, but hopeful stories, even experiments, even all the studies, eco-critical studies that are being done, shows that hopeful stories are having more effect on the readers. But to return to my question that I wanted to ask each one of you, Atulya, would you the next book on CliFi, the next CliFi that you write, will it be a hopeful story, or a story of slow change towards the better, or a dark kind of dystopia?
We'll have to keep this as the last question, huh, Raja? Because
I'll just ask Bijal the same question.
Sure.
And we are. Atulya.
Very briefly, my next book will be on disaster management. I have spent a lot of time on disaster management, and I have a feeling that disasters have a lot to do with failures of environmental management. It will be more realistic this time. I have sat on many of the commissions which have been doing post-morteming of disasters, like the Chennai flood of 2015, the forest fires which happened where a lot of people got killed and a lot of property was damaged. But it'll still remain fiction because I still have some more time in service, and I cannot be coming out with So it'll still be fiction, but maybe after some time, I may start writing more realistic and more hard-hitting stories.
Thank you. Bijal, would you just, what's
Uh,
your next project, and is it dystopia or utopia or something in between? Yeah.
I think we live in times that are already dystopian. So
Right.
that's pretty much my fiction is rooted in today's time. And Savi and the Memory Keeper, which Jairam sir has kindly read and actually blurbed, is out tomorrow. And that is about climate change. It's about grief. And it's about the healing power of nature and how it's actually what keeps us together as human beings. And of course, the magic of trees. I'm going to just end by saying, somebody asked me recently, saying, is your next book about climate change as well? And I said, what else would it be?
Yeah. Yeah, people are saying that all fiction will be climate fiction in the coming years. Okay, so thanks all of you. It was a very stimulating discussion, and we enjoyed listening to each of you. And we hope to continue this conversation offline. And please keep in touch. Thank you. Thank you, Pooja.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I had to interrupt, and I'm sorry I had to, remind of the time. But yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for making it so engaging throughout, the way you took audience questions and all of that. And all your wonderful different inputs, because everyone had a different space to come from. So yes.
Thank you.